I'm John Briscoe. Welcome to the Museum of the Historical Society of San Francisco. I'm the immediate past president of this historical society, the immediate past president of the Northern District Historical Society, and a member of the Ninth Circuit Historical Society. And they asked me to welcome you all. The three societies are co-sponsoring this evening's program. The building you are in has a very, very rich history. Just to take one facet of it, it was in this building directly caused by the massacres of Indians in Humboldt County, particularly around Humboldt Bay. In this building, within these very walls, in the early 1860s, that the literature of the American West took root and flourished. Think Mark Twain, Enoch Coolbrith, and on and on. That's a story for another day. Tonight's story is somewhat captured in the title of this program. And you may be wondering where on earth that title. We know the conventional history of the state of California, because when we were going to school, history and civics were taught. So we're taught the history of California. There was no mention of the people who had been here for 15,000 years, maybe 18,000 years, since the end of the last ice age. It began with 1542, when Cabrillo sailed the ocean of blue. Actually, it was 1550 years after Columbus, and discovered San Diego Bay. And then 200 and some odd years later, Spanish missionaries came and began the colonization for Spain. The United States trumped up, pardon the expression, a war against Mexico in 1846, was driving toward Mexico City when the Mexicans sued for peace. And in the end, gave up to the United States all of the American West, Utah, Nevada, most of Colorado, Wyoming, virtually all of Arizona, New Mexico, and California. On February 2nd, 1848, 9 days after gold had been discovered in the American River. The history of a place can be told through many lenses. Its natural resources, gold, wine, agriculture, soil, its literature, certainly a rich story that could be told here about California. The place, the humanity of a place, the inhumanity of a place, the democratic ideals of a place. Let's just take the latter. In the fall of 1849, with no authority from Congress, and only Congress could have given a bunch of white men gathered in Monterey and wrote up a constitution for California, the state of California. There wasn't a state of California. For California, the people of California. And they installed a three-part tripartite system of government: a judiciary, a legislature, and an executive to be led by a governor. The judiciary was led by a man named Sir Honest Hastings, a name that's probably familiar to many people in this room. And he was Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, the first, the premier jurist in the state. In March of 1850, the California Supreme Court, under Sir Honest Hastings, started business. Its first case is called People versus Smith. I don't know if Professor Manley is going to address People versus Smith. Any of you with access to a law library, just pull down Volume 1, California Reports, page 9, People versus Smith. It was a petition by a bunch of white gentlemen, I don't suppose this word, for release from jail while they were awaiting trial for having slaughtered an Indian village. The California Supreme Court released those men. That's the very first case of the California Supreme Court. The following month in April, the legislature got down to business, and it began enacting really important things like state holidays, how to pay ourselves. One of the earliest items of business was Chapter 133, April 22, 1850, Chapter 133 of the Statutes of 1850, the 133rd law ever passed by this state, which has passed hundreds of thousands, probably millions of statutes. The 133rd piece of business that it enacted was the Indian Slavery Act. This provided an article in Section 20 for the enslavement of an Indian or Indians at the petition of, quote, any reasonable person, which in plain language meant white man. Many of you can probably picture the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles. That city block, for decades, was the site of the largest slave market in the United States west of the Mississippi. That law, the Indian Slavery Act, stayed on the books for almost a century, until 1937. Not to be outdone, and we have a tripartite system of government, not to be outdone, the governor stepped up. On January 6, 1851, 170 years to the day before that other January 6th, Governor Peter Barnett gave his first State of the State address, the state's first State of the State address. And the highlight came when he thundered, and I quote, "A war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct." Thus was born the state of California.
I am deeply humbled and honored to be asked to give proper respect to my Ramaytush ancestors, Ohlonians, relatives of this land, past, present, and future, and to open this critically important gathering of scholars within and surrounding our tribal communities to again speak what was once unspeakable, the truth of our dark years of encountered newcomer colonizers. I share greetings on behalf of the Ramaytush people and the Ramaytush Ohlone Tribal Chair and Executive Director of the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, Jonathan Cordero. Although our ancestors were the first victims of gentrification in the peninsula many generations ago, the Ramaytush people have never forgotten, ceded, nor lost their sacred obligations and responsibilities as the original descendants and caretakers of this place that's we call Yaloma, and which you now call San Francisco. For indigenous people, the sacred obligations as caretakers given by Creator, she placed us in this place of origin, had never been relinquished nor extinguished. Our ancestors sacrificed greatly to the giving of their lives so that we, their descendants, can continue to fulfill our responsibilities as stewards of our homelands into modern times. I would like to start off this gathering, as I had taught my elders, in a good way, as they said, with a prayer song. There's a sadness to this song, not because of the content, but because it's not a Ramaytush song. As we'll be learning tonight, the last 250 years in California have devastated our communities in many ways, one of which was to try to remove the very lifeblood of our communities, our culture, our heritage, and our traditions. There's very little of the Ramaytush culture that has survived, and the same with very few lineages that have survived to present day. So I'm borrowing a song for Landmother's other lineage, the Rumsen Ohlone people of Monterey Bay. It is the frog song, and I use it not only to clear the sky, but to clear our hearts and our minds so that we can hear tonight the truth that is going to be spoken, and to let them into our hearts and minds and our spirits so that they guide us as we move forward. Ada Pachitiahuan was Tiakiam. 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 Oh. Thank you. This is an important event. This is a solemn event. It is a very necessary event. One that bears repeating until the lessons of truth strike deep and actually guide what and how our society moves forward. With these truths, we will feel pain. I know my indigenous relatives will feel pain. But whether you're a descendant of the targets of such dehumanizing history that we still experience up until this very day, or as descendants of those who perpetuated those actions, or in many cases, in the colonized methodologies of conquest, they both live within us at the same time. You will hear brutal facts, not supposition, fairy tales, storytelling, romanticizing, but the facts as openly, blatantly documented by the colonizers. Their disdain at that time in California history for our ancestors was not hidden or subtle, but was widely known and shared. The results will be discussed tonight in well-documented research, but our California Native communities do not need such testimony to confirm its veracity, because we live it every single day, including the continued implementation of many of those policies that form the foundation of the society and the legal and social structures we now live with. We live with this pain every single day, every hour, and every time we are engaged in our communities. We see it in the faces of our elders and in the eyes of our youth. But if we remember who we are and where we came from and why we came from, we can bring back their teachings that tell us that pain is not evil, but a necessary part of healing. We can learn to use the pain as a salve in the wounds of our emotional, spiritual, as well as physical being. Elders taught me that our sacred oral narratives, the stories that of how, where we need to be in the world, would be told many times. We would hear it often every year, and we'd hear the same thing. And then one day, an elder would tell it, perhaps for the 1,000th time it seemed, but we would hear something different. What happened? What changed? What did the elder add to that story? The elder didn't add anything to it. You're hearing it different because the story's changing so that you're better able to understand and listen and absorb the spirit and the understanding of those stories. The stories here tonight are the same way. And we must learn to comprehend them and take them in and feel that pain. You can't avoid it. The avoidance is what causes much of our suffering these days. We must embrace that pain because it's the pain our ancestors suffered so that we can still be here and still exist And then once you hear that truth, as the elders tell us, now that you know, what are you going to do with it? I'd spend on. Thank you.
The title of the subject matter is, as you've just heard from John, is California's War of Extermination against American Indians, both the legislation and the litigation. We have a terrific three-pack presentation. We have a full, but unfortunately, COVID got better in the full presentation. Before starting that, we're welcoming everybody here. There are, I'm told, several hundred watching this on the screen. People that are here tonight we're so honored to have them because in their background and their understanding and their knowledge, and you just heard a bit of it, of what has happened over the past, what are we going to call it, 150 years or more. The first panel is going to be moderated by Thomas Fuller from the New York Times.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Let me just start with a quick introduction, and I'll segue into what we have up here. We're going to talk about a period in California history from statehood in 1850, right around, and for the 2 decades afterwards. It goes without saying, this is the goal. We are sitting here in what used to be, in what was the first mint in California, exclamation point. And the gold that was mined in those hills came here and was pressed into coins, so we can feel the history we're talking about. The gold rush, obviously, an iconic period. Look no further than sports team and what children learn in school. With my daughter, it's all about the gold rush, right? Something else happened during that very same period, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. In 1850, at statehood, the legislature met and they passed a series of spending bills. And one of our guests can describe in detail that the largest single line item spending in these first years of California statehood was to finance massacres of Indians. So at the beginning of California's statehood, this is what they were spending their money. And it was a very corporate exercise. It was very detailed. Expeditions would go out and they would kill natives, and then they would file expenses, almost like an Excel spreadsheet of massacres. They would say, we spent this much on horses, we spent this much on food, and we spent this much on ammunition. Now please reimburse us. And the amounts that we're talking about here were really significant. And when I was introduced to this history by reading one of our panelists' books, it struck me that this is not very well known in California. This is not, when you think about early California history, you know that there were killings, there was starvation, but we don't think about a methodical state-sponsored program of mass. So that's just to situate us here. We have on it a person who studies history and a person who made history. And I find this to be extraordinary because normally we have a panel like this and we, talk about historical events. But it's not every day we get to question someone who actually was part of that history. So we have the person who made history, that is Chief Judge Abby Anti. She was first woman, native woman, to be accepted to the California bar. And she is also the Chief Judge of the Tribal Court. And next to her, we have a UCLA professor of Native American history. This is Ben Madley, and he is an author of a seminal work on this period that we're talking about. It's called An American Genocide. That's the name of his book. Highly recommended. It's exhaustive, and it fills in these details, which I think in California are neglected. I want to pull back the lens from what I've just been saying and maybe talk a little bit about the demographics of the time, just to give us a sense of scope and scale. Ben, what were the numbers in terms of who was living in California in the time period? Sure, that's a great place to start. We could have that first slide, please. So between 1846 and 1873, California's indigenous population plummeted perhaps 150,000 people to just 30,000 survivors. Now, historians have long posited that this is a process driven by disease, by dislocation, by the environmental catastrophe that was the California Gold Rush. What I tried to do in this book is explore the process of state-sponsored mass killing, the process that was undergirded by the law, by successive pieces of legislation having to do with funding, and then the way in which the United States Army took over the killing process during that. And since we have quite a few lawyers watching this, let's tell us how the system from the very beginning, and John alluded to this, was manipulated, was codified, I guess is a better word, to be very discriminatory. Tell us how the laws of California, starting from state in 1850 and just before, came to be, and what they said, where they positioned Native Americans. Well, let's take one step back. Let's talk about the period of military before people in California even tried to build this. So one of the things that the military officers in charge of California did was to create a pass system, which required Native people, whether they were in San Francisco, Monterey, or places, to have a pass. And if they didn't have a signed pass from an employer, they could be automatically arrested as vagrants and put to work on public projects like road building, bridge building, or constructing a dock. People building the state, as John Briscoe alluded to earlier, then built upon those precedents. So when people met in Colton Hall, that next slide, please, to write California's first constitution, these people were born in Europe, they were former citizens of Mexico, they were U.S. citizens. What they did was to almost exclusively prohibit anyone with Indian blood having the right to vote. So that excluded Indian people from participation in California's democratic political process. And then, as Mr. Briscoe alluded to quite eloquently, just to build on that, when the legislature met for the very first time in the spring of 1850, one of their very first acts of business was to make it very easy to force indigenous people into unpaid labor on trumped-up charges. They also passed legislation that barred people who were one-half Indian blood or more from providing testimony for or against whites in both civil and criminal cases. They also barred Indian people from serving as jurors. And soon thereafter, in 1851, they've also barred Indian people from serving as lawyers and consequently as judges. So what all that did was to keep California Indian people out of participation in and protection by this new state's legal system. Can we pause right there? Judge Abby, I want to ask you to build us a bridge of understanding between what Ben has just told us to modern day. When we spoke last year, I was reporting an article and I called you, and you were very helpful in talking about institutional amnesia. And what is when we talk about the genesis of the California legal system, and now you being the head of a trial court, fill us in on how the legacy of this discrimination is still carried over today.
Well, I think, we're talking about numbers, we're talking about systemic kinds of things, but behind each of these is a human being. Is somebody in my family, is somebody in their family. And each of those instances where you were included meant that pain came home with you and stayed with you and is still with us inside. And you go, okay, well, now you're the first lawyer. What did that look like? It was, for the system, it was very shocking. They didn't take it well, I have to say.
Can you tell the story about your first day in the courtroom?
Well, my first day in the courtroom was a judge saying to the lawyer I was standing next to, "Who's that?" And he said, a lawyer. And the judge said, "Exactly. She can't be a lawyer. She's an Indian." To which I replied, "You're half right, Your Honor," having always had a mouth on me. And it was pretty much that's the way it was.
What year was this?
You're trying to date. It was a while ago. I graduated from law school and was in the bar in the 70s. I'll say that. And, it was rough going home. And I think people had only recognized tribal people in orange jumpsuits. And so every time I would go up to the front, there was, issues with me being up there and trying to talk with the judges, trying to negotiate your presence. And that's the reality. That's the numbers are there. And yes, okay, you're the first one. And although I'm old, I'm not 500 years old, and so that impacts everybody. It impacted the clients who I was standing next to, because they had somebody for them that was different, who knew them, cared about them, and who could talk with them, and who did talk with them, and that made a huge difference. And the system is still trying to adjust to that. And what we're trying to do now, in part of our work at home, is to say, look, you all came here, not even 200 years ago, and have managed to just about wreck the joint. We were here for thousands of years, and we have not and did not do the damage you did. So we're going to try to help you now. We're going to help you with your systems and with your approach. And that's what our obligation is, because our obligation isn't just to each other, it's to place and to those who came.
One of the things when I was reading about this that struck me, I was previously based in Asia and Europe, where when you study history, you're going back, hundreds of years. Here we're talking about something, these massacres, for instance. We're talking about 170, 150 years ago. So if we're talking about a modern life expectancy, this is 2 lifetimes. I mean, this is really not that long ago. And then you study this, but you also grew up in the far north of California. And I remember we spoke about feeling this history, feeling the weight of this history, not just reading about it, but meeting family, meeting the descendants of settlers, seeing their name and connecting that name with some pretty bloody history. I mean, and so can you talk a little bit about that, how your how your upbringing has met your historical interest?
I spent a lot of my growing up
just one county over from Happy, in a place called Happy Camp. And there were two conflicting narratives about how the town got its name. One was that it was a happy camp because so much gold was found there. And the other narrative said that this was a happy camp because the massacre that started the place was so successful. So, growing up in that area, you knew that when you got to Indian Ferry, there had been a terrible massacre in that place. And those Cutter people were killed for no other reason than that they were corrupt people. No other reason. And it is very close to us, all around us. Not just that we both know people who have great-great-grandparents who survived massacres, but also the place names all around us in this greater area. There's the city of Fremont. And if you know a little bit about the history, it's hard not to go anywhere in California and not be confronted. Fremont and through John C. Fremont had many killings, but most famous 1846 Sacramento River Massacre, which perhaps as many as 850 or more with 2 people were slaughtered by elements of the U.S. When I arrived in California 7 years ago, I drove through this beautiful state, and I was in love with the scenery. And I have to say, after doing this research, and I'm interested in how both of you feel about this, after learning about massacres in Lake County, massacres on the Russian River, massacres, on an island off of Eureka, it changes your view of California. And of course, this sounds, almost naive to say, but Judge Abby, how do you deal with the weight of that? And how do you think we should deal?
Well, for me, it's different because for me, it's my responsibility here is to become a good ancestor. I have good ancestors. They didn't do that, and I can look out and I can see our place that I'm related to and is related to me. So I don't have that, these things happen, and I can say, and a good example was this year, some fish died because there was a slide because a burning had occurred. So the river got clogged. And I went down to the river with my dog and I was looking at it and it was all green and full of algae. And I started to cry because I said, I'm sorry. I know my responsibility to you and I couldn't, and I feel bad about that. But that I can feel bad about, because I'm here and I'm trying, and my obligation is not to win. My obligation is to not quit. And that's how I, basically.
There's a retired judge in California who told me a story about using a database in the California Judicial, using it for years, and it's called the Serenist database, named after Sir Hastings, as we heard from John earlier, first Chief Justice. And when you saw the name of this database, I presume you came into contact with it. What did that mean to you? I mean, it was a database named after someone, as we know from Ben's scholarship, who was a landowner, who hired people to ultimately change massive opinions of. Is that an example of how so recently this horrible past is there?
Part of the rest of the example is that when the trial in court, state court forum was formed, one of the first things we did was change that. And I was on that forum, and that's what I mean about not quitting. Yes, you could do that. All things can happen. But, sooner or later, one of us is going to grow up and be in and try to say no. And that's what happened. And it's not named that.
What about if the minute and a half that we have left? We can talk about the past. We can mourn the past. What, Chief Judge Javier, are your recommendations for going forward? What are the things that California can, that we can all do, both ways of thinking and
Well, I think one of the huge mistakes of this country in its formation was the whole idea of the melting pot. Drop your culture when you get here. Because frankly, many of the people who came here did not have cultures that would support this behavior. So go back into yourselves, into your history, into your view, and come out what you should do. Because this is not and would not have been accepted when you came here and they said, okay, if you want to be in this country, jump and creed, do this. Well, that's a new thing. That's not what I ever. Go back to that and then we can talk.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you especially for our panelists.
Our next presentation is going to be on conscientious advocacy dealing with this entire problem. I'm going to ask Mike Abraham to come up and moderate and talk to probably one of the brightest individuals from lawyer in California right now, George Foreman, who has lived the whole subject matter of indigenous people in terms of advocacy. Ask both of you come up if you don't mind.
Good evening, and thank you for letting me be here with you. This section of the presentation deals with litigating to avoid extermination. Litigation has at various times been instituted by California natives to avoid direct and indirect extinction. One example are the lawsuits brought to maintain sufficient water flows to preserve the salmon stocks in the Klamath and Trinity rivers. In 2013, California tribes successfully litigated in the Northern District to enforce dam operating criteria and water flow to avoid jeopardizing the survival of coho salmon in the Klamath River. Subsequent lawsuits were necessary and have been brought in the Northern District and have resulted in injunctions that reserve water for flushing flows to wash out parasites that would otherwise kill the juvenile salmon. The seriousness of this problem cannot be overstated. In 2014 and 2018, over 80% of the juvenile salmon in the Klamath River were infected with parasites and perished. Because the California native tribes depend on the salmon for sustenance, for income, and for traditional ceremony, it is truly a matter of litigating to avoid extinction, both for the salmon and for the tribes. As a member who prides themselves being active in environmental communities, including trying to preserve the rivers, I thank the California natives for what they've done and what they are continuing to do. Another example of litigation to avoid extinction took place in the Northern District in what is referred to as the Extermination litigation. Termination means an act of federal recognition and the distribution of tribal lands. Due to the enactment of the California Rancheria Act, 44 California tribes were identified for termination, with Congress promising them
improved roads, water systems, sanitation facilities, and vocational schools before termination was supposed to become effective. Instead, while tribal assets were distributed and federal recognition was then denied in these groups, the federal government failed to provide the promised benefits. As a result, the groups who were impacted by the termination efforts brought lawsuits challenging termination on a variety of theories. To tell us more about this untermination litigation, we have with us tonight George Foreman. George is a 1967 graduate of the University of California at Berkeley. He is a 1970 graduate of UC Berkeley's Law School. He began his career with the California Indian Legal Services in 1970, and over a course of 15 years served as a staff attorney, directing attorney, executive director, litigation director, and director of a special untermination and recognition project. In 1985, George entered full-time private practice. George has taught as an adjunct professor at UC Hastings College of Law for over 10 years. I'd like to welcome George to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, good evening, everybody. California's rancherias and their residents were and are the least visible element of California's least visible population, its native peoples. This is not an accident. In part, it was a survival strategy. You've heard from others about the genocide practiced against California's indigenous people. But in the 1950s and part of the 1960s, during our lifetimes, at least people as old as I am, when I was in school, and unknown to the general public, the federal government pursued a policy called termination that was designed to literally make rancherias and their people disappear. They were no longer to be reservations. They were no longer to be Indians of the law. This was the termination policy. It was part of a broader post-World War II federal effort that began in California and Wisconsin and Oregon to assimilate tribes and their citizens into the surrounding communities and eventually get the federal government out of the Indian business in those states and presumably at some point nationwide. As has been true with almost every other federal policy dealing with its native peoples, it failed to accomplish its objective and left considerable damage in its wake. What are rancherias? How did they come to be? Well, you've heard about the 18 treaties that were negotiated with various components of California's native population in 1850, 1851. The treaties were never ratified. The states urging, the Senate locked them in a box, kept them that way until 1905. There was some growing awareness of the plight of California's native people, particularly in Southern California, with Helen Hunt Jackson's Ramona book, and they still have that pageant down in San Jacinto every year. But in Northern California, a group called the Northern California Indian Association began generating public awareness of the plight of these people. And at that association's urging, the Office of Indian Affairs, the predecessor to today's Bureau of Indian Affairs, appointed a San Jose lawyer named C.E. Kelsey to undertake a census of the landless and homeless Indians in California. And he journeyed throughout the state, in largely the rural areas, identified native people where he could find them, wherever they were allowed to live. Sometimes it could be a family or two. And based on his report, in 1906, Congress passed the first of a series of appropriations with which Agent Kelsey went out and actually bought land. And if he could, he bought the land under where the tribe were living. If that land wasn't available, nearby to which they could be relocated.
he created 45 of these rancherias, as they became known, encompassing about 7,500 acres in toto. This land typically was marginal in quality at best, rarely had natural resources, and there was basically no federal financial assistance available to improve living conditions. In addition, the state, because the land was held in trust by the United States, although not necessarily for a particular tribe of people, the state had no jurisdiction over that land. So there was no law enforcement, and the residents of that land had no access to California's courts until 1953. Michael has briefly encapsulated the things that were supposed to happen before termination was effective. Primarily the most critical being installation or rehabilitation of domestic water and sanitation systems, because most of these rancherias lacked either one. To establish survey the rancherias and mark out the boundaries of the lots that were going to be distributed to the individuals, and provide educational and vocational assistance within the limits of available appropriations. Well, that was some very interesting language, the available appropriations. The Bureau of Indian Affairs sent field representatives out to meet with the communities. And at these meetings, people were led to understand that preparing a distribution plan for the assets of the rancheria was mandatory, which was true. That Congress had authorized the appropriation of money to carry out the purposes of the act, which was also true. And that only through an approved distribution plan could the community hope to obtain any of the benefits that were to be available under the Rancheria Act. Not so true. The Bureau asked people who should be listed as distributees of the assets and who would be listed as dependent members of their immediate families. These were the people who, upon listing in the distribution plan, upon publication, notice of the plan, Federal Register, would lose their status as Indians. If a potential distributee named someone as a dependent member in the family, there was nothing done to verify the accuracy of that listing. We had situations, and I'll come to in a minute, where somebody listed as his dependents kids that he had never paid support for, that were in fact eligible for enrollment at another reservation. They were listed, they lost their eligibility for BIA education variants. They were not given notice of the listing. They were not given an opportunity to contest it. So, the lands were held in trust. Because they were in a trust, they could not be mortgaged. So residents couldn't finance housing improvements or other improvements to their infrastructure. Living in substandard housing, lacking adequate domestic water and sanitation systems, limited access to federal vocational or educational assistance, and typically located in areas with limited employment possibilities. Acceptance of termination not only seemed to be inevitable, but also the only way to improve their living conditions. What nobody told the residents at that time, and this wouldn't come out till many years later, was that although the Rancheria Act authorized the appropriation of $509,235 to carry out the purposes of the Act, the Bureau has secretly promised Congress that it would not seek the actual appropriation of the money. And the money was never appropriated. The Bureau was left with the same inadequate budget to carry out the Act that it had been unable to provide services to the community since World War II. So now those who accept termination got almost none of the promised benefits. They were subject now to property taxes, which they hadn't been before. They were subject to zoning regulations, which sometimes precluded developing the land because the BIA had carved the lots into so small parcels that it couldn't support a septic system. They had no wells. And now their land could be taken in foreclosure for debts. So many distributees lost their lands to creditors or the tax collector, or they couldn't get building permits or finance to not be able to conform to county zoning or other codes. So the Rancheria Act continued. It's never been officially repealed. Well into the 1960s.
In mid-1960s, California Rural Legal Assistance opened an office in Santa Rosa to deal specifically with the problems of termination. In 1967, that office became California Indian Legal Services, which filed several Northern and Eastern District lawsuits against the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service to enforce the obligation to provide water and sanitation assistance. Those early lawsuits, unfortunately, were settled for the provision of some water and sanitation facilities, but they did not change the status of the tribes or the status of distributees and their dependents as Indians. We at CILS, when we opened an office in 1972 in Ukiah, took on a strategy to not only get people what they were promised, but actually to restore their status as Indians, to restore the status of the tribes as recognized tribal governments. And Jim King, who had struck down California's prejudgment attachment law when he was working at Sacramento Legal Aid, successfully took on the issue of the Bureau's failure to provide notice and an opportunity to be heard to those kids who were listed as dependents. He brought his due process chops over to termination. We won in a case called Eddie Knight versus Morton. The Northern District Judge unterminated all of the people who were been listed as dependents on rancheria distribution plans throughout the state. Jim next turned his sights on untermination itself. We filed a couple of cases in Mendocino and Lake counties for the Hopland Rancheria, the Robinson Rancheria, arguing that the failure to provide these services before distributing the assets was a violation of the federal government's trust responsibility, as well as violation of the Rancheria Act itself, and that should undo the effect of the terminations. We won. And Judge Schwartzer, Judge Schweigert, and Judge Williams all rendered judgments unterminating a number of specific rancherias. The big break in those cases came when Jim King was taking a deposition of the former area director, as they called it then, a guy named Frank Haggerty, who was the one who revealed for the first time the secret deal that the BIA had cut with Congress, that they would never ask to have the money appropriated, that the act authorized to be appropriated. Obviously, this came as a big surprise to Jim, very dramatic, but it came as a bigger surprise and a shock and an offense to his sense of honor of Assistant U.S. Attorney David Golay, who was our adversary in these early cases. That revelation was so offensive to his obligation to do justice that he and later Assistant U.S. Attorney Charles O'Connor became allies in the effort to obtain justice for those who had been so wrong. As a result, he worked with us, and we got Table Mountain, Big Sandy, Table Bluff, and the Upper Lake Rancherias unterminated. The government never appealed these decisions, and ultimately the government was held liable in damages for loss of property taxes, and that sort of thing. We had to take that to what was then known as the Federal Court of Claims. In 1979, Dave Rappaport and Les Morris, two other CILS attorneys, filed a class action called the Tilly Nordman case. That was on behalf of 34 different rancherias. Ultimately, Judge Williams certified as a class action and entered a stipulation for entry of judgment that restored the status of 17 rancherias, the status of all of the people of those rancherias as Indians, and that allowed the reconveyance of lands that had been taken out of trust back into trust for individuals and for the tribes. Unfortunately, 17 of the tribes were not able to participate, to benefit from that, partly because they had settled earlier water and sanitation cases, and several of those tribes ultimately got restored through legislation. Creighton Rancheria, for example, if you've driven up through Leonard Park, or you've seen their casino farther north, several others. But it was a tremendous fate to be able to be part of that effort. And Judge Schwartzer, Judge Swigert, who was sometimes known as Sweet Old Bill, or initials to that effect, and Spencer Williams, aided by the creativity and the perseverance of a handful of dedicated legal services lawyers, the dedication, honor, and integrity of Assistant U.S. Attorneys David Golay and Charles O'Connor literally resurrected numerous Indian communities in the northern and eastern districts of California that federal policy had tried to erase. The growing viability of those communities as functioning sovereign governments, providing for their people the basic governmental services and protections that most other communities take for granted, are the enduring legacy of those who made it possible. Thank you.
Let me suggest to you that this is the last, not suggest, tell me this is the last presentation of the night. Excuse my voice. It is Managing Genocide. It's a project of the American Indian Cultural District by two truly outstanding people. We have Shariah Souza sitting in front of us. She's the executive director of the American Indian Cultural District. And we have Paloma Flores, the director of the Community Development and Partnership for the American Indian Cultural District. We're going to wrap this up with basically some fabulous comments from these two who have been working and dedicated their entire lives. They'll show us film clips, and I'll give you now the two that will present this. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shariah Souza, Tadatas Pueblo, Kiowa. It's an honor to be here today and be a part of this really important conversation, especially with so many foundational community members in this room that made this all possible for us to be here today. But just a little bit of background, the American Indian Cultural District was founded on March of 2020, and our cultural district is technically located in the Mission District of San Francisco. But as we all know, everywhere that you go, as we had Greg open up for us today, you're on Ramaytush land in Yulamu in San Francisco. But we founded on March 20th, and that is really of 2020, and that is March 30th of 2020. And that is really due to the efforts of the American Indian community that's been here. And that's due to, not just being on native land, but it's also due to, when we think about Lenita and our audience, I want to acknowledge that, when we think about San Francisco, we think about that occupation of Alcatraz in 1969 and the catalyst of that really was the catalyst for a lot of what happened across, American Indian, but was the catalyst for really what happened across the American community, a lot of our other folks, and the different movements that happened here. And just acknowledging Mary Jean for KPO Native Voices for 50 years of really just honoring and elevating the Native voice in San Francisco. So we're here because of the people that laid that groundwork before us, and we're here to continue to elevate and support the visibility of Native people and bring in cultural resources. So I just want to give you a little bit of historic context of who we are and what we're here to do. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the American Indian Cultural District is working on something called the Indigenize Project. So there are roughly, I believe, 9 now cultural districts in San Francisco. And one of the things that we're responsible for doing, aside from bringing in resources for the American Indian community, is placemaking and placekeeping, really creating visibility for American Indians in San Francisco. And so we're working on the AICD Indigenize Project, and the Genocide Mapping Project that we're about to share with you tonight is part of the AICD Indigenize Project. And the AICD Indigenize Project has actually several components to it. One is the Genocide Mapping Project. The other is really artwork and murals. And then we have our street signs, and we have something called a walking stories trail, where we really take back the history and the narrative of what happened in San Francisco through an American Indian lens, led by the voices of those. So we've done a lot of recording of folks. You can go out to the different sites, and do a QR walking tour, and go to the different places, like the Old American Indian Center, or go out to Alcatraz, or go to, Indian Ed and learn from the students, learn from the people, learn from our community members about the history of American Indians in San Francisco, and that history is still going, that we're still here. And so that's a big part of our Indigenize project. Is just it's part of a bigger lens. And really, as we talked about tonight, the intention of the federal government, the intentions have been to erase American Indians and erase our voice. And so what we're trying to do is bring back that visibility and bring back those narratives with Native people throughout the city and really create that visibility. And so that brings me to the project that we're working on, and that is called Mapping Genocide. And so what we ultimately did is we started working with, and I love to give credit to Jason McConnell. He's a researcher who did a lot of the background research of this. If we go to the next slide, mapping streets, please. But essentially what we asked him to do is to look at the history of American Indian businesses and organizations within San Francisco. And he really started digging into different place names, in which I'm excited. Jason also got appointed by Deb Haaland on the committee for place names. So he's going to be working at a federal level with the White House to do place name changes throughout the United States. So kudos to him for that and for helping us lead it here. But essentially, one of the things that we had him do was start looking at the history of place names in San Francisco. And where there was a lot of data that he found was in the streets. We think about, Columbus, we think about Lyon, we think about Fremont. I wanted to share with you, I took a few of the streets that we actually mapped. There's over 37 streets throughout San Francisco that actually honored those who contributed to the genocide of American Indians. So when we talk about genocide today, we talk about colonization. Colonization is what happened on the land. What we don't talk about is coloniality. What's happening in our minds, why we're normalizing that we're driving down Fremont and Lyon and Columbus Street every day, why we live in what is one of the most liberal cities of San Francisco, and we don't think about what this city's founded on and what we continue to honor as we fly our flags and pass our racial equity initiatives, is that our city is founded on and still in our mind. We don't have that decolonization, that decoloniality of our minds. And so what I'd like to do is bring awareness. So we mapped out just a portion of these streets. Our office currently is over at Fort Mason, Mason being one of the people that I'm about to touch on. But just so you can see just a portion, it would have been really crazy if we mapped out all 37 of them. But these are some of the core streets that are traveled down every day. Lyon Street being something that is traveled down by over 4 million people a year. I think 2,000 people a day at a minimum traveled down Lyon Street. And so I'm going to pull just a few notes. There's 37, but I picked 4 of them to share with you all. The first street I wanted to share is Fillmore Street. Fillmore was the president during the California Gold Rush. And as you all just know a little bit and heard a little bit about that, in his first congressional address, he recommended raising militias to secure newly acquired Western lands. So basically he used, that position in his first congressional address to wage war on American Indians to take our land. And the other the other street that I wanted to mention is called Burnett Avenue. Burnett came up already. And basically he was the first governor of the U.S. state of California. And in his first address to the legislature, he said, "As an act of the government and protection of Indians that made Indians guilty until proven innocent, and established enslavement and legalized punishment of Indians." And so he basically, California's governor founded on, these are some of the streets that we drive down every day that founded the history of this city on genocide. Fremont is another one that I wanted to share. And again, these people have come up over and over again, but Fremont participated in the mass murder of over 1,000 Wintoon people along the Sacramento River, including women and children. Another street that we chose to honor in San Francisco. And another one that we don't think about every day when we just hear Lyon Street, but Nathaniel Lyon was the commander of the Bloody Island Massacre in Lake County, murdering over 500 Pomo men and women. And thank you, Madly. I just wanted to mention, when Jason did the research, he looked up in the San Francisco, he looked up place names in San Francisco and basically took some of these names and cross-referenced them with some of the research that Madly had done in his book to get those instances of genocide. And so those are just 4 streets that we we drive down every day, that we see, that a lot of people visit, and you don't really think about that history and the strong history that they had, some, presidential war folks, governors, and really what our history was founded on in San Francisco and what we still continue to elevate today by choice. So one of the things that I'm excited that we are working on in regards to streets is we've actually been working with a street locally on a street locally within our district. We're working with a community member right now, and we have intentions of elevating that street and changing it. It currently reflects a person who's involved in war, and we'd like to change the name of that street in order to honor her family members. So she asked me not to share that, but we are in the process of changing a street name right now. So the next, if we go to the next slide, please. So the second thing that we looked at, or we had Jason look at, was the statues, monuments, and memorials within San Francisco. So San Francisco has over 4,000 statues, monuments, and memorials within their public arts collection. 100, specifically, that are statues, monuments, and memorials. And out of that 100, 10 of those statues, monuments, and memorials are actually statues and monuments and memorials that honor those who have contributed to genocide of American Indians. So we all talk about Junipero Serra or Columbus, but some of the other ones that I wanted to share were General Henry W. Halleck. Just the other day, I was at DMV and I sat down for breakfast and ate a bagel, and I didn't even think twice about what the statue was. But General Halleck was President Lincoln's general chief during the Civil War, and he served as Secretary of State under martial law in California. In November of 1847, Halleck instituted a statewide Indian pass system and required Indians to carry paperwork or face arrest and forced labor. In Halleck's pass system, he sought to control California Indian laborers, and the pass system criminalized Indians that were not employed by non-Indians who left their employers without written permission. And so, again, from Madley's book, basically, we have this giant statue at the foot of NOPA, north of Panhandle, entering Golden Gate Park. One of the, parks that we celebrate. We do a lot of our marches, and we go down every single day. And that is someone who, basically legalized American Indian slavery and elevated it in San Francisco. So I just wanted to bring that up as one of the statues. Another one that we don't think about is Mason. Fort Mason is currently where our office is, and I, really, happy to be there on the water. It's healing, but Mason also has a really strong history. Mason actually provided forces to people in Southern California, 1 to 2 men per each ranch, to slaughter American Indians, to wage war against Native folks. And so again, what we've chosen to name some of our bigger buildings and our bigger. So Mason is both a street in San Francisco and it's Fort Mason, and Mason is also a statue within the monuments collection. And then on the last one, I've only got Mason here, but I want to expand that list because only 10 statues have been identified specifically with genocide in California. However, we don't think about the statues that we pass every day that don't technically match the definition of genocide. One of those statues, for example, being within Golden Gate Park, there's an area called Pioneer Park, and there's a woman statue. And I was walking by and I thought, oh, how beautiful. You see this woman and her children. There's a statue for women in the park. But it's actually like one of the first pioneer women of colonization and her children, and how women were actually part of the colonization movement. So here's one of the statues that are actually honoring women, that's honoring women colonizers. So that might not outright be identified as a statue that is honoring genocide, but we just think about what we've chosen to elevate as one of the most action-oriented, racial equity forward cities as we're sitting here having this conversation. Think about the roots of this building. Think about the roots, not just of the policies, but the streets that we drive down every day. And so what we're working on at the American Indian Cultural District and with our community members and the people here is really just building out a way, the truth. We've all talked about the truth today, but we're working on a way to bring healing, not just through policy, which is amazing and needed, also just on the ground. And so I will leave my colleague here, Paloma, to tell you a little bit more about the healing aspect. And before I do that, I did want to share a couple wins that we've done. And the first one is we actually have 3 members on our board, myself being one of them, to sit on the Statues, Monuments, Memorials Advisory Committee with the San Francisco Arts Commission. And recently what that committee does is they look at the criteria for new statues and for the removal of existing statues and what's going to happen with the statues. And I'm really excited to announce that we had great support in adding genocide as part of the criteria for removal of statues, not just harm, because one person's harm, right? One person's hero, as we honor all these people that are clearly somebody's hero, could be, another person's monster. And so specifically saying those that are related to genocide is now setting up criteria for those statues to be removed within the San Francisco Arts Commission. The second thing that I wanted to share with you all is we just recently worked with Supervisor Melgar's office to pass an American Indian Truth and Healing Reparations Advisory Committee. And you might ask me, why am I sharing this in relation to genocide mapping? It's because it's, again, local policies for American Indian folks, for their voices to come together and be heard, to continue to carry out this work so that we can bring healing to this. And the last thing I wanted to share with you as we talk about the history and what's happening in San Francisco is we recently started working with planning and the Office of Historic Preservation, well, not recently, within the last 2 years, to secure funding for the first American Indian historical context statement in the city. And so, these are all things that we're going to start working on and bringing the community together next year. But it's ridiculous that, again, we're on Native land and the city has historic context statements on a majority of the communities within the city, even 2 on certain communities in some circumstances. And we have yet to have one on American Indians. We're not even seen as a people. And the final thing I wanted to share is, when we first started this work with housing and planning, they had American Indians listed as 0.2% of the population in San Francisco. And I'm like, something's not right there. We look at that. Everyone in this room knows that San Francisco is a relocation city. Everybody knows how abundant our people are in this city and that we came here for a reason. There's been many waves. And so we were actually able to work with them and identify that American Indians are 2.1% of the population, over 17,800 people within San Francisco. So I just wanted to point that out. And that's folks that identify as one or more races. And then technically we're 1.1% of the population for those that singly identify. But a lot of us are mixed. We've been here for a really long time. And for us, if you're native, and those are our people and they count. So you knew a little bit of the truth, and I would like to pass it on to my colleague, Paloma Flores, to tell you more about the healing. Thank you.
Indeed. Good evening, everyone. To me some way. My name is Paloma Flores. I proudly represent the Pit River Nation of Madesi and Atsuge bands on my mother's side. I'm here to share with you, after you've heard the truth, a truth. In being a good ancestor, it's less than 500 years ago, less than 400, less than 300, less than 200, 198 years since the first documented account of contact for my own tribe, Pit River Nation, in 1824 by a Hudson Bay fur trader who just observed that there was people who dug pits, who chased game into there. Pit River, near less than 200 years ago. That's 3 grandmothers. Great-grandfather growing up, telling his grandkids, Daniel Webster, don't trust them. Who? Those who came. Because when he was a child, it was still legal to hunt and kill Indian people. For many of our California Indian people in this room and beyond, they're here by pure virtue after enduring 3 waves of colonization due to survival, adaptation, and the desire to ensure that they have a future generation, even if it meant they had to change and shift. In the project that we're working on, mapping genocide in San Francisco, it's deeper than just mapping out the strengths of those who committed atrocities against American Indian peoples. It is an opportunity to bring visibility and to elevate the community's voice. One of the main goals of this project and where I come in is to work strongly alongside one of our new consultants who's been tasked with helping us build out an outreach process that will bring in community voice so that it is truly community-driven. Another focus in this moving forward to elevate Native voices is to also ensure that in the coming year, it's right around the corner, 2023, Q1, we're going to be holding 2 town halls. In those town halls in San Francisco late in January and mid-February, We will ensure that we have an opportunity to have direct community feedback, talking about the chess report, talking about the historical context statement, and more importantly, bringing in an opportunity for the community to provide their voice and lead this process. Because as a community, we're only stronger when we are together. As we move forward in this, and I'm now very pressed for time, I prepared for a 7 to 10 minute, now I'm in a 3-minute. We have a chess report. This chess report is required in the city of San Francisco for all cultural districts to develop around areas of community, housing, economic workforce development, education, and there are many other acronyms. Community feedback that will serve into developing a policy. That policy, that document, along with this historical context, will serve as a firm foundation to build upon. It's great to have a resolution. It's fantastic to pass ordinance, but that doesn't last beyond the person, place, program, or grant funding source. So when you combine the community voice and you bring in the policy through this direct feedback loop, you make sure that those young people who are coming up right now in this city don't have to continue to do the work that those like to sit in this room and say they're first, Honorable Judge Abby here. They will not have to be the first. We will learn through this process and make mistakes perhaps, so that they can then build upon. Because the legacy that we are leaving is the legacy that we are living currently. This city of San Francisco would not be San Francisco had it not been for the lives of the California Indian people across the state, where many of you just heard a brief history that was yesterday. As we move forward in the genocide mapping project in San Francisco, not only are we calling upon our community to support us in this effort, we will need additional support from allies across the way. So if you are someone who's been inspired by this movement, which has been flowing for about 200 years, we ask that you look for the information that's out there and come and support us in this good fight, because it is a good fight, because we are good ancestors, and we are doing our best to honor the lives that we have by building foundations, by embarking on projects such as this that will serve to be a policy later. Groundbreaking, because this is yesterday's history. 2 weeks ago on November 14th, many of you may be aware and may not, that there was a Native American statue that was put up at Capitol Hill in Sacramento, representing a recent traveled loved one. And you'll see the image there. A groundbreaking, first ever. We are inspired by this, so we take the example of what's happening in the state. We learn from it, and then we bring it here in this beautiful city, where we're going to have our community lead the process in identifying, along with meaningful partners such as the San Francisco Public Library, San Francisco Heritage, and SF MoMA, right alongside Native artists, to envision what they'd like to see in place of many of these statues and many of these streets, as my colleague here had mentioned earlier. Community-driven, focused on creating lasting change and building with meaningful partners. Telling the truth. This is an opportunity to provide the healing. Thank you.
What I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank the moderators and our speaker. At this point, I am convinced that some of you have some questions of these incredible people. And I would ask if it's at all possible for Your Honor and our professor to come up here, because I want some questions put to them. If you don't mind, you just move those chairs right over here. And I'm going to ask you, John Briscoe. John, come up here.
ask any one of our lady panelists to field that question, and I think the question will be embedded in the answer for those who are watching at home or their own.
I think the way you do it is you look at these two and you go, yes. You know, that's how I did. Because I was so pleased and happy to hear them talk and be sure about their work. And to know, I'm almost done. But look at what they're doing. Look at how that's what you want, and that's what you want them to do.
Any other question from the audience? Or did somebody else?
Yes. May I just add? Great question. You do it because you have to. Anger is not worth it. Be angry, but that doesn't yield any positive outcome. You do it because you don't want to see the next generation have to continue with this fight and hope that things were different. Because once they learn the truth of their existence and how their identity has been shaped by U.S. policy, you either stop or you move. I personally want to talk about that mapping of genocide, a dream that was inspired by the work that another organization is doing that I just have to call out. Our California Indian Cultural Center Museum. I went to a workshop and they showed a map that we were doing in partnership with Google and the Pioneers Indigeneity Forum. And on this map, these young people had mapped out these sites in California that had these atrocities. They mapped it out to such a detail. And I thought to myself, if they, as younger people, high school students, could take that on, then why aren't we doing that here in this city? And then I joined forces with Miss Sharia Souza. She shared this ideas, and the alignment came. You pay attention to what our young people are doing, saying, thinking, and feeling, because they know. They want to see the change just as much as our elders do. So we bring that bridge together. There's no room for anger. You change. When you change, you have to be willing to shift when the change is here. So that's how I personally am not angry as a California Indian woman. It's a responsibility, and one that's quite honorable.
The question for those, again, watching this, listening to it, streaming, is, has anybody on the panel picked up the connection between ecocide and genocide? Did I paraphrase your question correctly? So anybody?
This one. I mean, as any of us, or I'll always speak for myself as American Indian people, and all Indigenous people, everybody in this room should have protection. The earth is our mother, right? And when we start to think that it's okay and commodify Mother Earth and the way we treat Mother Earth and the way that we do things to Mother Earth is a reflection, those policies, that anger, that toxic dumping is the same way we treat our people, is the same way we treat our women. You can't separate the two. You can't separate the mindset behind the two. It's all a colonized mindset. So those same policies that we train to harm Mother Earth and that same mindset of commodifying, of otherism, of lack of interconnectedness is that same thing that we use to treat the people. Because once it's no longer, any of you are no longer my relations, I don't have to care about you. You're somebody else. But we all live in the same place. We're all indigenous to somewhere, right? And we're all connected. And so I think it's that colonized mindset. Of course, there's an interconnectedness between everything. That's just, I think it's all up here.
The question again for those not here in the room is whether any of our panelists has considered the restoration. Yes, you specifically mentioned Shell Mound in the East Bay as a way to address full genocide and ecocide. Did I fairly paraphrase your question? Who would like to take a stab at that?
Can I make a suggestion? I mean, like, stick it down just because we're on untouchable territory with some out here. It would be to defer to rank respectfully. Is that something that we can do?
All right.
Shell mounds are important, but they're not the point. And by that I mean that they're expressions of our culture. There are many ways to express our culture. And I think one of the things our elders tell us that we have to do with reality. Shell mounds can't exist in this reality that we have now, so-called modern civilization. I think it's important to observe them, to study them, to understand them, and to share that knowledge with the community. To restore them, probably not, because they can't exist out, as an isolated part of the environment. They were part of a very different environment before time, before contact. So it would be extremely difficult, except maybe as a demonstration, which would require a lot of acreage, which isn't likely to happen in the area. Just talk to people who are in East Bay, who are trying to preserve the West Berkeley shell mound, which is a very relatively small plot of land, and yet there's a fierce fight over it. So to restore a shell mound actually is probably not feasible in a realistic way. But I think there's things we can do around it, and actually we have some pending projects that might address that, to where we're going to be talking about protection, preservation, and the education of shell mounds.
I agree. I think that's what happens is you have to go tribe by tribe, person by person, and try to make it right. And that's what they're asking is how do you make it right? And that's a discussion. I can't say, well, we made it right by doing this. That's not my business. If somebody comes to me and says, how do you make right what happened here in this place, meaning my place, then I can say something and I can have a conversation with them. But it's not for me to say for everybody. And part of it is that people have got away from talking to each other, from being in community. We're all here now, and we better go forward as a community. And we better look at our values. And from those values, we have to develop practices. And this discussion will be part of that practice based on the value we're together. And what happened is still with us, sure. I can still hear the cries of my mother. I can still hear the cries of my aunties. I will always hear them forever. But that doesn't mean that I can't have a conversation about what happened, because I can.
Well, folks, on behalf of the Northern District.
Yeah,
One more. Okay, we're well over time, so one last one. Yes, please.
There's a lot at stake when we talk about genocide, reparations, return of land, the land back movement, thinking about how we commemorate or don't commemorate the people who are victimized, people who victimize. But we can't have that conversation as citizens of the state of California when we don't know our history. And I'm sad to say, as a professor at a large public U.S. California university, that most students who are California citizens come to UCLA virtually no knowledge of their state's real history. The history that you're revealing in your work, a history that you deal with in your court, a history that you're talking about in your work, and the legal cases that you're addressing. These folks up here are talking about the real history of the state of California. But until we have that conversation, until we have that knowledge, we can't really move forward. So as an educator, that's my role. I'm an educator. We have to get California Indian history into our public schools. It can't just be building the mission projects with the little sugar cubes. Really, we're sweeping atrocity. That's what we're doing. We need to integrate this history beginning in preschool, continuing in kindergarten, and all the way through the 12th grade. And that's how it has to, that's how we have to address this. Right now, it's all buried in it. There's a very small number of people in this state who know anything about it. So as an educator, I would say that's what we need. Right to your state assemblyman, right here, state senator, your congressman, your federal senators, your local school board members. Get this in our education.
The time went pretty fast for all the information that needs to be part. We barely scratched the surface. And I completely agree with Professor Ladley that the education of our own people, kids, of our own adults that have gone through the entire school system is abysmal. And to have any conversation moving forward, people have to understand first. You can't converse with somebody who doesn't have the basic facts or grasp. But there is one crucial fact that is pretty obvious that we be carried forward from this intensive discussion. It's an undeniable fact, and that the war of extermination against them failed. They didn't eradicate us. They didn't eliminate us. They didn't exterminate us because we're still here. We have always been here. As our sacred oral narratives from our elders have taught us, we are here now to give testimony to these facts and these experiences. And we will always be here till novice find walls for the last time to sleep. Even in the case of the Ramaytush ancestors, so few, so oppressed, as they lay in hiding for such a long time, until it was safe to come out and reassert the place they have as a sacred commitment to be caretakers of this place, Yulam. I know that among our sisters and brothers in this audience and out in the virtual world, there are those that are deeply struggling with the pain that this discussion has brought out. It's perfectly understandable to have this pain. There's nothing wrong with you. It's the natural and inevitable result of 250 years here in California of violence that it came about our people and still travels through us, through our DNA, through our experiences, through our lived lives up until this moment. When we teach our young people about ceremony, we guide them around the sacred fire that is always at the center of our ceremonial grounds. We tell them that fire is not evil. It is a gift, and it is an instrument. It is up to us to whether it is destructive or not, and to use it properly and give it the proper dignity it deserves. Pain can be the same. Pain that has been showered on us the last 2.5 centuries by those who believe that we are less than human, and a social, political, legal system that still is embedded with those tenets and still afflicts us to this day. We see this now with such things as the attack upon ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act, that is occurring as we speak in Washington, D.C., that threatens the survival of our families. But just like fire, pain is not inherently, it's telling us something. It's teaching us something. It's speaking to us. And if we have the courage, we can turn that pain into a gift, an instrument of healing and renewal. How do we do that? How do we push through How do we take that pain and lead to healing? Our ancient traditions are still here for us, waiting for us to awaken to them and to hold them dear again. That's how we heal. And that's how we take the pain and make it work for us. An elder worked with my father's saloon people years ago, and he taught us something that he had learned. His name was Frank Lupanian. And he said, you did not do your ceremonies for a long time, but they continued nonetheless. And now you're bringing them back and giving them form. Ceremony is spirit brought into view in the world. We do not create it. We open the door of our hearts and spirits and let it walk through us in this world so we can see it and join in with it. And we can do that again, just as our ancestors did at the beginning of the world. They first learned these things from Creator, who gave them the responsibility and the obligation and the commitment to take care of the world and to take care of each other. The core of being indigenous, I believe, is we are part of a web of creation. And the daily sacred commitment is to renew and rebuild that relationship with creation and all the things that are created that are a part of it. Another elder taught me something that I think for those who have lost their way, Dr. Darrell Bay Bolton said that we are each born with that spark of indigenous knowledge, whether we see it or not, whether we recognize it or not, whether we exercise it or not, it is still there. And we can grasp it and use it again. All that we do should be guided by these ancient understandings. And so if you understand that, you believe it, what are you going to do with it? I say to you, Kom shacholo. Don't be afraid. And I'm going to ask my indigenous relatives here in the room, and not only in the room, but out there in the virtual world, where everyone who's hearing me, Kochel, stand up. I want you to stand up. These people walk among you, you just often don't even know the history and the culture and the spirit that they carry. So I want them to be acknowledged and recognized. My indigenous relatives, just the fact that you're standing is resistance to the genocide that we've been talking about this evening. And to my California relatives, I want you to look at each other and look at yourselves. You are the living embodiment of a dream. A dream come alive of our ancestors long ago. A fragile dream of ancestors traveling in their huts to the sounds outside. A fevered dream of ancestors locked in rooms as slaves in supposed holy missions. A drenched dream of sweat from ancestors running through the hills, trying to escape neighing horses and bellowing men. A faint dream of ancestors and elders in cramped squalling rooms and city ghettos. A dream of elders walking through storms of weather and hate to protest what is being done to us, as they did at Alcatraz, as they did at Standing Rock, and in other places. In hidden corners and open spaces, these dreams are now finding form again, just like our ceremonies. And each one of you are the moral of the story. that needs to be told again and again. Every day, every breath, every heartbeat. Go shun. Don't be afraid. Go chill. Stand and embrace your destiny. That's Brandicon. Thank you. Yaha. That is all.